morning sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of the five-star restaurant, casting golden hues across polished tables and half-filled champagne glasses. The air was thick with quiet tension, the kind that only existed when people of power and wealth sat across from one another, trying to seal deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. And there, right in the center, sat a billionaire named Charles Donovan, the man who owned half the skyline of New York, yet at that very moment looked completely helpless. His face was pale, his hands fidgeted, and his eyes darted nervously between a small black notebook and the elderly Japanese businessman across from him. The translator who was supposed to mediate the meeting had canceled just an hour before. Now, without anyone to bridge the gap, the multi-million-dollar partnership he'd been chasing for months was seconds away from falling apart. If you believe in the power of kindness, second chances, and moments that can change lives forever, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Thread, because stories like this remind us that sometimes the smallest act of courage can rewrite someone's destiny. Charles had always believed money could fix anything, and for most of his life, it had. But as he stared at Mr. Takahiro, the stoic Japanese investor who didn't understand a single word of English, he realized that power had its limits. He had rehearsed every number, every pitch, every future projection, but without language, none of it mattered. The restaurant's quiet clinking of glasses felt deafening now. Sweat gathered at his temples. He tried showing graphs, gesturing with his hands, forcing awkward smiles, but it all seemed to confuse his guest even more. Mr. Takahiro, a man of grace and patience, simply nodded politely and placed his napkin down. The meeting, months of planning, was slipping through Charles's fingers like sand. Across the room, a young waitress named Emily noticed the scene unfolding. She wasn't supposed to pay attention. Waitresses in fine dining places were trained to be invisible. But Emily had always been different. She saw things others didn't, small human details that often told bigger stories. She noticed how Charles's hands trembled slightly when he lifted his glass, how his voice lowered when he realized words weren't landing, and how disappointment clouded the Japanese gentleman's expression. Her heart clenched a little. She'd been there before, powerless, misunderstood, lost in translation, not in language, but in life itself. Just a year ago, Emily had been sleeping in her car, clutching her late father's worn-out Japanese-English dictionary. He had been a language professor, gentle and wise, who taught her not just words but empathy. He used to say, "Understanding someone's language isn't about words, it's about respect." After his death, Emily had lost direction, her scholarship, and her confidence. Working at this restaurant was her lifeline, a quiet attempt to rebuild. She hadn't spoken Japanese in months, but the sounds and rhythms of the language still lived somewhere deep in her heart. As she approached Charles's table to refill the water glasses, she heard him murmur under his breath, "God, I can't do this." That single sentence, desperate and raw, was all it took. Something inside Emily shifted. She looked at Mr. Takahiro, who sat patiently, and before she could stop herself, she softly greeted him in Japanese. The man's eyes widened in surprise. Emily bowed slightly and introduced herself. For the first time since the meeting began, the tension broke like a fragile shell. Charles blinked in shock, unsure what was happening. Emily turned to him, her voice calm but steady, and said, "Sir, I speak Japanese. I can help if you'll let me." For a moment, there was silence. Then hope flickered in his eyes like a dying candle catching flame again. She sat beside them, hands clasped nervously, and began to translate. Her words flowed gently, humbly, but with precision. She didn't just translate language, she translated meaning, emotion, and intent. When Charles spoke of innovation, Emily spoke of legacy. When he mentioned profits, she conveyed vision. When he tried to explain market expansion, she framed it as cultural collaboration. Each sentence carried more than business. It carried humanity. Mr. Takahiro listened carefully, nodding with growing interest. His reserved demeanor began to soften, his eyes warming as if he saw in Emily something rare, sincerity. Hours passed, like minutes. Plates were cleared, coffee replaced wine, and laughter replaced silence. Emily found herself fully immersed, her fears dissolving as the rhythm of language took over. The two men, once strangers, separated by misunderstanding, now communicated through her heart and her father's teachings. Charles was no longer the panicked billionaire. He was a man rediscovering connection beyond money, and Mr. Takahiro, moved by the humility of the young waitress, began to open up about his own journey of starting with nothing, of valuing people more than profit, of believing that trust was the truest currency. When the meeting finally ended, Mr. Takahiro stood, adjusted his suit, and smiled at Emily. He spoke in slow, deliberate English. "You remind me of my daughter. Your father must be proud." Emily's throat tightened, tears glimmering in her eyes. Before leaving, he turned to Charles and said something quietly in Japanese. Emily translated, her voice trembling with disbelief. "He says he'll sign the deal. He trusts your heart." The restaurant fell silent for a moment. Charles sat there, stunned. He extended his hand to Emily and whispered, "You didn't just save the deal. You saved me." But Emily only smiled faintly, whispering, "Sometimes kindness speaks louder than words." Later that evening, after everyone had left, Charles waited for her outside. The city lights shimmered in reflections across wet pavements. He handed her an envelope, his voice softer now, stripped of the arrogance money once gave him. "I wanted to offer you something," he said. Inside was a check, a number Emily could barely comprehend, along with a note that read, "For the bridge you built when I had none." But Emily, her heart still heavy with emotion, handed it back. "Sir," she said, "you already gave me what I needed, belief." What she didn't know was that the next morning, Charles would make a call that changed her life. He offered her a position in his company, not as a translator, but as part of his international relations team. Within months, Emily's life transformed. She moved out of her tiny shared apartment, began attending business conferences, and even helped launch cultural exchange programs that connected small startups across continents. Her story spread quietly at first, a waitress who turned a millionaire's panic into purpose. But for Emily, it was never about the money or fame. It was about honoring her father's memory, proving that understanding, empathy, and kindness could rewrite even the coldest boardroom deals. Every time she looked at her old Japanese dictionary, she remembered that morning when courage whispered louder than fear. Years later, when a journalist asked Mr. Takahiro why he trusted Charles's company, he smiled and said, "Because one waitress showed me the soul of their business." If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness and courage still matter in a world obsessed with power, please like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Thread. Your support helps us keep telling stories that remind people of hope and humanity. Before we end, we have one special request. Comment below, what's one act of kindness you'll never forget? Because sometimes a simple word, a helping hand, or a brave decision, just like Emily's, can turn an ordinary moment into $1 million miracle.